There's a straight line from Hegel to Woke, and that line is drawn through Aufheben.
Hello, this is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Gil. Here with me today is Lillian.
Hi.
Will.
Hey.
And Owen.
Hey, Gil.
All right, so today we are doing the second part of our series called What is Dialectics? If you haven't listened to it yet, I recommend going back and checking out the first episode in the series where we talked about Kant. Today we're moving forward a little bit in our history of philosophy and talking about Hegel. The four of us looked at a few passages from his 1830 Encyclopedia and the preface and introduction to the Philosophy of Right. So Hegel was one of the major post-Kantian German idealists alongside Fichte, Schelling, and my beloved and mostly forgotten Maimon. All of them were involved in a project to restore metaphysics after Kant's attack in the three critiques. Basically, Kant had said that we don't have the right to talk about the nature of things in themselves. We can only talk about how they appear for us. He thought that we could do that systematically, but that we could never legitimately step beyond appearances and know the nature of reality or things in themselves. That sounded a lot like the death of metaphysics, and a lot of people even today think that this is a good thing. If claims about the nature of things in themselves are just ungrounded, wild speculation, we should, probably cut that out and just talk about how they appear. But not everybody was satisfied. Kant himself argued, as we saw when we talked about the transcendental dialectic from the first critique, that we can't help but step beyond those limits and make claims about things in themselves, and probably most importantly, claims about freedom. And it wasn't actually clear how it was possible for us to have any systematic or scientific knowledge of cognition without some kind of metaphysical commitments. If reason has this structure that Kant was able to pick apart, that sure, fine, but where did reason come from? What the hell is it? At the minimum, we seem to be saying that reason exists, which does sound like a metaphysical claim of some kind. And what's the relationship between reason and the things that it knows? How does understanding even work? And what's going on with that mysterious thing in itself? So all the great post-Kantian German idealists are trying to resolve these kinds of puzzles. They all buy Kant's critique, and they don't want to return to pre-critical metaphysics like we used to get with my good boys, Spinoza and Leibniz. They thought instead that it was necessary to redo metaphysics after Kant's critical intervention. In their eyes, this would complete Kant's project, which they saw as being essentially unfinished or ungrounded. Now, Hegel's really complicated. Really hard to rein him in and talk about him. I'm sure we've all got a lot to say. In broadest brushstrokes, I think we could say that for Hegel, the nature of reality, which he calls the in itself, just is or has the same structure as the way it appears to us, which he calls the for itself. So in the end, there's no real difficulty in explaining how cognition is possible, because things in themselves and our cognitions of them have the same basic shape or are identical in some way. But, as we saw with Kant, our reason is at least sometimes contradictory. And Hegel's actually going to say it always is. Reason enters into conflict with itself. Things appear to us as conditioned, and reason demands that we get to the unconditioned, which can't be given in experience. There's these infinite demands, infinite understanding, which can't be realized, but which make it possible. We fall into all these unavoidable antinomies, where we make contradictory claims about things that both seem necessary. And here's where things start to get weird, right? If Hegel says that things really are as they appear to us, and the way they appear to us is contradictory, then what we're saying is that the nature of things is contradictory in itself. And I think now we're getting closer to Hegel's understanding of dialectics. Last time we talked about how Kant couldn't draw limits around cognition without stepping beyond them somehow. Right? In order to draw a boundary, you need to be on the other side of it. And Hegel wants to say, yeah, that's right. And it's true for things as well. He thinks real things can't be determinate. They can't be limited or finite without also themselves transcending those limits. Nothing remains within itself. In order to be what they are, things need to negate the limits that make them what they are in the first place. This is the sort of thing that we get with Hegel's conception of dialectical negativity, and it just goes way beyond the critical boundaries that Kant had set up. Right? We're doing like full-blown speculative metaphysics now, and Hegel thinks he can do it scientifically. So there's way too much more to say, and I've already gone on for too long as like a little intro here. I think I just want to flag up that we might also connect the dots between Hegel's idea of dialectics and a few other themes like his idealism, his concept of history, and of course all the stuff from the philosophy of right on freedom, civil society, and the state, which might get us into his political conservatism. Maybe we could only just do 100 more Hegel episodes, but I'm going to stop there and pitch it to you all and see what you all have to say.
I want to ask a clarifying question first. So part of what you just said in introducing Hegel is this story about the life of metaphysics. And you said that Kant's metaphysics is understood as critical metaphysics as opposed to like what the early moderns were doing. And then Hegel steps into this like speculative metaphysics mode. I just feel like if you're not in the metaphysics world, this like staging, it's not even that clear to me what that means actually, because I just see them as just different arguments about like the nature of reality, and it seems like there's more of a story to stitch together for you, and that would be like helpful for me and maybe for the audience.
I wonder if I'm definitely going to let Gil answer this question, because I think Gil is our resident idealist who we're hoping can guide us along. But near the end there, I was thinking about, so what does Hegel make of, let's say, the appearance reality distinction? So it seems to me that for Hegel it isn't like there's this appearance and then there's this unknowable reality underneath it. But in your introduction, and I think this seems right, but this is very strange, Hegel wants to say that there is a homology between appearance and reality, or he doesn't think that appearance is reality, right? Am I misunderstanding, or does he actually think that? Because this is so wild to me. I've realized a lot of people call out and say I'm doing Hegelian dialectics, then you actually read it, and this is far beyond what I was expecting. A far less 𝙈𝙤𝙧𝙚𝙗 and Robin DiAngelo than I was expecting. I will say that. And so is he saying that in other words, the problems that Kant set up aren't really problems, because it actually turns out that as things appear, that is also true. That isn't merely a mystification, a distortion, hiding something that to which we don't have access to about reality.
I think these are actually probably these questions are both connected, because I think like pre-critical metaphysics, right? When Hegel uses a term like pre-critical metaphysics, I think he's referring to a metaphysics like someone like Spinoza, right? Where Spinoza just like starts the ethics. If you look at Spinoza's ethics, right, he just starts it on God, and he just starts laying out like the features and the nature of God. And so like a critical metaphysics wants
cold turkey.
Just go right away. Boom. Just no epistemological justification in advance, or, I guess he did some of that in the treatise on the imitation.
How do we know? Doesn't matter. Here's what God is.
Just go. Here's what God is. Let's go. So like the critical metaphysics, I think it wants to step back and ask about thinking, not just start making crazy claims about the universe. Like, what are the conditions? What are what's the justification? What is thinking, first of all, right? And so before we jump out into the universe, I wrote this on my notes.
And sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? Like, before you jump out into the universe and start making wild speculative claims about the nature of things, like, don't you have to get your own thinking in order first, right? And start asking serious questions about, well, what are the limits of thinking? What is the nature of thinking itself, right? And that's the critical moment. I think Hegel's problem is that Kant stays there, right? He never leaves that critical moment, and then you get stuck with just what is internal to thinking, as if it were radically separate in some way from the nature of things as they actually are.
Yeah, that's right. And so like the other sort of like representative that I mentioned of pre-critical dogmatic rationalist metaphysicians is Leibniz. And if you've read any Leibniz, you know that like his picture of the world and reality is bonkers, essentially, right? It's completely wild.
Well, this is why I love it.
Don't we all think it's monads without windows?
Yeah, we're all just an infinity of windowless monads that makes up the world, and they're immaterial substances in this pre-established harmony, and it's the best of all possible worlds. And it's like, what in the hell are you talking about, right? So then Kant comes along and he's like, whoa, you all, can you please just like
Slow
tell
down.
me what cognition looks like? Slow the fuck down.
Put down the drugs.
But then like But then, like Owen said, right, this sort of critical turn is kind of unsatisfying in a lot of ways. And like the most representative problem is the thing in itself, right? So like I have these representations in Kant where like things are given to me in some way of like my sensibility and receptivity are like affected by something. What is that something? Don't know. Can't say anything about it, right? And so like literally the relationship, there's a non-relation between appearances and the things that are supposed to be appearing. Because if I could say what those things were, I'd actually just be talking about how they appear for me, right? I wouldn't actually be talking about the thing in itself. And so the thing in itself, like Kant will sometimes be like equals X, like literally just an unknown thing out there. But if we think that, you know, there is something like understanding or knowledge, you're not just like thinking like just this weird empty form. You're thinking things. You're thinking of stuff. You're actually cognizing real things in some way. But with Kant, we can't actually bridge that gap, right? And so all of these post-Kantian German idealists are like, we need to do this metaphysics. We need to be able to talk about what these things are in themselves, or what the nature of reality is,
or what God is, or the soul, or
God, or the soul, or freedom, right? All of this important this stuff. Which means that we have to go beyond like Kant's prohibition, right? With Kant, he says like, okay, we might have these regulative ideals, we might have these sort of these maxims of reflection or whatever, but we can't actually talk about freedom being actual, or you know that like we actually know what things are actually like. And Hegel comes along and says like, no, yeah, things just are as they appear actually, right? Like to answer your question, Will, like what's the relationship between appearance and reality? Well, it's the nature of this reality for it to appear. That's no longer a story about me cognizing it. It's a story about how reality itself becomes this appearance. It's part of what it is for it to appear in this way. And this is already sort of like we're getting a little bit at this sort of dialectical negativity. I think a lot about like one of the moments in the Science of Logic, which I didn't ask you all to read, and I'm really sorry. This is too much. He wrote too many. His books are too long. Yeah. I think we can all agree.
Well, he only wrote 4 books.
He only wrote 4 books, but they're really hard.
My advisor never tired of telling me this. Hegel only wrote 4 books. Don't read those lectures.
But I think a lot about this one moment in the Science of Logic where he's talking about essences, and we think of things having an essence. But then he says, like, if an essence, like, just stayed, like, and we think of the essence as, like, the inner truth of the thing, right? Whatever that means. He's like, but if it actually just stayed inner, then it wouldn't be anything. It wouldn't mean anything. It has to appear. So the line is essence has to appear. And then, like, what is the essence of the thing? For it to appear in that way. And then what is the appearance of the essence? And this is this sort of like dialectical relationship, right? With Hegel, things never stay themselves, right? They always become their opposite, but that's how they do what their work is. That's how they are what they are.
So basically, like, if some inner essence, if some like, the real you, if we want to make it like sort of personal,
Great
something
example.
like no
Great
one had
example.
any access to, that was merely private. Well, then that thing creates no availability for anything else beyond it. In fact, what would it mean to even talk about that if it never makes itself available? And so what Hegel is trying to say is that, well, it can't be that there's this, mystical secret that never appears, because that actually would never appear for us. Because it turns out when we're thinking about things that appear for us. And if I can be a little bit, maybe it's not too technical. And so it seems as if Hegel's saying something along the lines of, as I narrate what I am doing when I am thinking, the conditions of my thinking, guess what? You also are actually narrating the conditions of the world itself. Yeah. You're also narrating what is out there. And so he's able to solve this problem of, well, actually, it turns out you can never actually get locked into your subjectivity. As soon as you're investigating that, you also are investigating the structure of the world. Because, if I can say it this way, there's almost a mirroring between the structure of consciousness and the structure of the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe it's worth pausing just on that element of what dialectics is for Hegel, right? Because one of the conventional ways I think dialectics is understood is that it's a kind of method. It has to do with argumentation, or it has a kind of method for thinking. And I think for Hegel, that makes it sound as if it's something that we come at the world with and then try to kind of try to impose basically on the order of the world. It's our method for understanding it. And I think he wants to push away from that kind of impositionist view of method and say that, like, the method of dialectic isn't something we come up with just in our cognition, right? It's the actual structure of things And as a method of thinking, it's a way of tracing the dialectical development, right? The unfolding through oppositions, right, of reality itself, right? So there's a distinction between dialectics at the level of theory and dialectics at the level of the world, but that distinction is not, we shouldn't reify that distinction too much, right? Because dialectics at the level of theory traces actual dialectical unfolding in the world.
Yeah, this is, I think, one of like the things that people get wrong most often about dialectics for Hegel. You're exactly right, Owen. He says very clearly in a bunch of places, he's like, if you think by dialectic we mean like a method that I impose on things, you've missed the point, right? In one of those passages that I asked us to read, this is from the Encyclopedia. And actually I do want us to talk about this. It's really interesting in this part in the Encyclopedia. It's like sections 79 to 82, where he's like, well, look, all rational content, all rational or logical stuff has three moments. And the first is this abstract moment called the understanding. And then the second is what he calls the dialectical or negatively rational moment. And the third is the speculative or positively rational moment. So that's important because like it means dialectic actually doesn't get the last word for Hegel, which is weird. Most people don't like think about it like that. But there he says when he's like, okay, what is this dialectical part? He's like, it's when these finite determinations like transcend themselves and we have this transition into opposites. And he says, usually people understand this to be like, an arbitrary external, like, imposition of a certain kind of rational content. He's like, that's not it. That's not it. Right? Like you said, I like the example that you gave too, Will, about like the real you. Right? Like sometimes someone will do something that is like harmful or damaging, right? They like say something if I say something that hurts your feelings, and then I'm like, that wasn't really me. That's not really me,
It
like
is,
the Hegelian moment here is like, no, that really was you for sure. Like there was nothing other than you there, right? You don't get to say that there's like an in itself of you that's different from how you affect others.
Okay, we need to pause here because
We need
Yeah.
to pause here, really.
I agree.
So many
lot.
pauses.
We
Lot
need
of
to
pauses.
pause here a lot.
A lot of pausing.
okay. So the way I want to pause here is to try to make an intervention that zooms ahead to other people who take up Hegel, and those are people who practice something like critical theory. When someone does critical theory,
Robin DiAngelo.
always Robin DiAngelo. Like at the end of all paths is Robin DiAngelo, arms wide open, smiling, saying, "I've been waiting for you."
You've heard
You're
about
so
the Hegel to
fragile.
D'Angelo pipeline, right?
Yeah, and I hear it's 𝙁𝙤𝙀. Yes, Jimmy
𝙁𝙁𝙀,
Concepts. So when someone does something like critical theory, where they want to say there's something wrong with society, there's something fucked up with it, they are implicitly saying something like, this society isn't really the way things ought to be. That, this society, there's something false about it. There's that sort of language of we're not living up to our ideals, like, in the United States, or we're not living up to this notion of justice. So those imperfections, racism, sexism, that's not really what the United States is about. Those are merely contingent phenomena that don't grasp at this ineffable essence of justice. Hegel would say something along the lines of, no, that makes no sense. What this thing is its movement of appearance. And the reason why I say I want to pause here, because Hegel is a strange bedfellow for those who want to talk about, well, these contradictions in reality say there's some imperfection, when what Hegel seems to actually be saying something along the lines of, no, the movement of philosophy understands that things are the way that they are.
Yeah.
In fact, maybe this will be controversial. I don't know other people's interesting readings of Hegel. Philosophy actually leaves things as they are. It merely, comes to comprehend, this is the truth of their appearance. And so what Hegel takes away is this notion of, like Gil's example, that wasn't really me, is no. All is apparent. All is appearing. That is what it is. And what you need to do is to grasp that in its truth, rather than disavow it and say, no, like that's not part of this. That's not part of this.
Okay, so
I don't know if that helped at all, but yeah.
Yeah, no.
I think it does help, but I actually just want to take another step back, because we kept saying all this stuff about essence and appearance, and to be honest, it's not that clear for me still. So we have this pre-critical metaphysics that was going on before Kant. Kant comes around and he's like, we need to think about what it is that reason is doing. We need to reflect on reason itself as opposed to making assertions about the nature of reality, which is what metaphysics does, by the way. So you're talking about what's the nature of reality? What is real? And then Kant sets up some problems, and then Hegel comes in and he tries to solve Kant's problems. And one of the ways that he tries to solve those problems is like the problem of the antinomies and the limits of reason, is he's saying that Kant has fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between reason, or maybe even what philosophy is doing, to the world that it's trying to understand. So like what you get when you read Hegel is what I always think about when I finish reading some of these chapters is I feel like Hegel's given me a little experience in what it is like to think. And he's trying to like tell philosophers that you need to come to terms with both the speculative nature of thought, but also like the strangely, even though he's down to speculate a lot about the appearances as they are, like Will was saying, he's also okay with some pretty obvious limits to philosophy. So if what philosophy is doing is kind of reconstructing like the appearance of the world to the philosopher, then like the philosopher can only be a reflection of like a movement of history. And so like that is a certain limit to reason in a way that even Kant doesn't put that particular limit on reason. Hegel does.
I think that's exactly right. And I've thought about this a lot because, like, you know, say what you will about Kant, I think you do get a really strong normative or like ethical project in Kant. And it's because he thinks that we can talk about oughts in this very strong way, right? I can like talk about like what I ought to do and what you ought to do. And I can look at the world and say there's like, you know, it ought to be other than the way it is in terms of freedom or what have you, justice. But Hegel kind of evacuates the ought, right? In this really strong way, in a very Spinozist, in a weird Spinozist way. Yeah. So that, like, as you said, like, you know, the job of philosophy for Hegel is, like, I like the way you put it, it's this rational reconstruction, right? He wants to say that, like, look, there already is a rational structure to things, right? Things actually already do follow reasons. The job of philosophy is to reconstruct them and to give that structure give rational form in like articulated discursive thought that was already there in the thing. And this is what when he talks about method, he always says like you just have to like follow the determinations of the thing in itself, right? Which we have access to.
Implicit to explicit. Does that help?
Making it explicit, exactly.
He calls it making it conscious.
Puts it. Yeah. Making it conscious, exactly right. So that he says at the end of the preface, and this preface to the philosophy of right is like incredible. Oh yeah, it's an amazing text. But he says all this stuff about how, like, you know, what's the task of philosophy? It's to, you know, he says philosophy is the exploration of the rational. So for that reason, it's just a comprehension of the present and the actual, not the setting up of a world beyond, which exists God knows where, or rather, which we could definitely know, we know where it exists, just in the imagination. He's like, great, you imagined a different world. Cool, thanks, Plato. What about this one, right? And then at the end of the preface, he even says, like, people always ask philosophers to, like, give instructions. And he says, philosophy always comes too late on the scene to perform this function, right? And this is the famous Owl of Minerva line, right? He says, the Owl of Minerva begins its flight only with the onset of dusk. He says, it's the thought of the world. So it appears only at a time when actuality has gone through its formative process and attained its completed state. So, like, I think you're right. There's almost no future in Hegel, right? All is retrospective, right? Looking back and trying to come to terms with what's come before, which is like this really, I don't know, this really deep way in which like all thought and all philosophy becomes historical for him.
Okay.
But like, I do think we lose the ought and the future.
I was just going to say really quickly, because another line from the preface that caught me, and this is, you know, because he has long sentences, he's German. But, you know,
he's German.
He has a fraction of a line where he goes, so that for this reason alone, we should be at peace with actuality. And this struck me because, the type of Hegel that I was given coming through grad school is, a Hegel that, people like pump all this revolutionary politics into. And,
for sure.
in my head, the Hegel that lived in my head is like, this is the man who's like, who came to save us and all of that. This is the man who allows us to talk about freedom bursting forth, and it needs to burst forth. But actually the text of Hegel, he's saying, if that's something that happens, philosophy is the wrong place to look for it. Honestly, when reading this is my favorite pop cultural reference. You know what I was thinking about? I was thinking about Marlo Stanfield from The Wire, where this drug dealer is talking to him and all that, and he just keeps saying, "You want to be one way. You want to be one way." And the guy goes, "Stop saying that. Stop saying that." And then Marlo just takes out his life and goes, "But it's the other way."
But it's
and then
the
he just
other
walks
way.
out, and all of a sudden I was just like, "Oh my God, Marlo, the Hegelian thinker of necessity."
Marlo is Hegelian.
That,
Yes,
absolutely.
You can invent all these possibilities of what should be. I believe there's also another place in the Encyclopedia where Hegel's like, "Is there anything more empty than abstract possibility?" Yeah, I guess you could imagine all sorts of things. I'm not sure what that tells you. And so, it's as if Hegel is saying, philosophy, what is it doing? Dipping into these possibilities of the world should look like this, the world should look like that. And maybe this can help us to start talking about what Hegel's doing with the state, when he's saying, no, what you are doing is documenting how it is. And getting people to reconcile themselves to the way it always already was. And if you think you're doing something else, then I've got news for you. You've missed the boat, because what is actual is rational, and what is rational is actual.
Yeah, I don't know if you all remember this, but like maybe 10 years ago in continental philosophy, there was like a spate of, like, there was lots of papers being presented and lots of sort of like talk about, like, everyone's favorite phrase was like, things could be otherwise, right? And like all of critical theory was like centered on this idea, and like lots of like sort of, insisting on the contingency of things, right? Things could be otherwise.
Oh my God,
And
the
I always
obsession with novelty. It was so
the obsession
annoying.
with the new, I know, and the different. And I always just thought, like,
The event.
right? Like the event could happen at any time, and then everything would be different. And I always was just like, I guess things could be otherwise. They're not. So like maybe we should try to figure out what is, If things are this way, they have to be this way for a reason. Can we get to grips with that? Like, just asserting abstract possibility is like always trivially true and not very interesting.
Okay, but can I pause this one more time? Because there was one more thing I wanted to before
We can call this episode The Pause.
Before we get to the politics stuff in the state, I just want to back up. There's one more thing, Gil, you mentioned this distinction between the understanding, right, on the one hand, right, dialectics or negation, right, and then the speculative. Because if we're talking about comprehending the world as it is, and we're making claims about how it is, right, and rather than how it ought to be, right, I think we should kind of zone in for a second on this concept of speculation, because I think that is for Hegel what it means to actually. I hate to use the word understand now, but it means to actually grasp in thought, right? To render explicit, discursively, to grasp in thought the way things are. So he says that, this is an amazing claim, everything true, insofar as it is comprehended, can be thought of only speculatively. Everything true, right? Insofar as we can possibly comprehend it, can be thought,
I'm sorry, what?
Can be thought of only speculatively.
Only speculatively.
So what the hell is the speculative for Hegel? And I think that's something that we should just discuss before we move on. And I just want to say one thing about it, which about the kind of contrast with the understanding, right? It seems to me that he's trying, through this contrast between the understanding and the speculative, to push us beyond Kant, which he seems to be doing a lot of the time, because he seems to be identifying the understanding with the Kantian understanding, which is the kind of categories of thinking. And so at least my impression is that the understanding is that part of cognition, that mode of our thought, which breaks things into kind of discrete elements, right? Treats them as discrete, separate, independent entities, and then talks about their relation, tries to frame their relation to one another. Whereas the speculative vantage seems to want to look at the relationship between seemingly opposed or seemingly differentiated things and to see them like under the aspect of their relational element, right? Under the aspect of their relatedness rather than under the aspect of their discrete identity. So just as quick examples like freedom and authority, for example, right? Or freedom and right, since we looked at the introduction of the philosophy of right. Freedom and right seem to be discrete. The understanding, right? The only German word I'll use, I promise, 𝙤𝙤𝙧𝙚𝙚𝙨, right? Understanding, knowing. The way of understanding things, that mode of cognition looks at freedom and like right and authority as discrete opposites, right? And somehow we need to figure out how to bring them into relation to one another. How can we impose authority on this thing, this other separate thing called freedom? Whereas the speculative view is ultimately going to say that freedom and right are actually immanent to one another, right? And you have to, if you trace the unfolding of the concept of freedom, you interrogate that concept, you will arrive at, right, a robust conception of right all the way up to the state.
Okay, yeah, I want to talk about this because
Moments. I went on too long there, sorry.
No, you didn't. Because I think the imminent thing is important. So something that somebody said earlier, I forget, that the interesting thing about Hegel is that what people take away from Hegel is that dialectic is like, that's what we know about him. He's like the Hegelian dialectic. But for Hegel, it seems that dialectic is actually just one moment of what we need to understand. It's actually not what philosophy is doing, and it's not like pointing out the dialectical moment, which is like the progression of finite moments that kind of like seem different, but then you've put them together in their relation and you see, okay, freedom and authority, they're there together and they need each other, and actually they kind of sublate into one another, and they change. There's a reliance there, and you have to see its historical shape. There's that moment of relation that people tend to focus on as being the dialectical moment, where it's like, look, there's a contradiction, but actually they need each other, and like that. And so like, but that's just one part of it. There's this additional step that Hegel thinks is important, which is apprehending these oppositions in this more like speculative way. And I want to understand what the speculation is. Like, what is the understanding that's different than just pointing that out? And like pointing out those oppositions and contradictions in their relation. It seems like he wants to take us like one step beyond noticing those things. And it seems like immanence, we have to see the development and immanent progression of, I don't want to use like, of our own rationality, like that. And I don't always understand what people mean by immanence, but it seems important because the last episode where we were talking about the difference between what Kant is doing and what a critique can be in its negative mode or in its immanent mode. And I think that Hegel is like the philosopher that's like going to make immanent critique a thing, and that will matter to like telescope to Marx and the critical theory tradition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, okay, I'm going to try to pick up on one of the things you said there, at least. So let's stick with an example of like what Owen was just saying, like freedom, right? And so the Kantian language for this that we have is autonomy on the one hand and heteronomy on the other, right? Where autonomy is where I freely determine myself, I give myself the law, and I'm heteronomously determined. I am subject to heteronomy when something else is constraining or compelling me in some way. I'm subject to someone or something else. And now, like, the apparent opposition between these two is clear, right? The abstract understanding is like, well, I'm either autonomous or heteronomous, right? Only one of those things. And then the sort of dialectical moment in this sort of progression moments is actually the way in which I'm autonomous is via the establishment of these things called the state, which for me subjectively feels like heteronomy, but which objectively is like the condition and means of my autonomy. And the speculative moment is holding that together as a positive result of this thinking, right? It's no longer just that there's this contradiction, but that we have like a positive claim that comes about from the unity of these contradictory oppositions, right? And so like I struggle with this too, Lillian, because I sometimes think I'm like, all right, I think I see how this third step is different than the second, right? Like speculative moment, positive content. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes I'm just like, I don't know. I feel like I just got stuck at the dialectical moment where I like see the unity of opposites or something. Some other language that people use to talk about dialectic in Hegel is of the negation, right? And like this is like a version of that where like in the preface to the philosophy of right, one of the clearest examples that we get of this is when he thinks about like the I. Right? Like everybody says I when they are speaking of themselves. Every I is this it's a universal abstract thing, right? Everyone says I, and it's kind of, this unlimited abstract universality. But also whenever I say I mean me in particular, as this concrete determinate person, me, right? And he says the unity of these two, right, is what we mean by individuality or personality, right? That it's a determinate content, a positive existing thing that is also universal, and sort of trying to like hold together universality and particularity is something like what he means by the speculative or third moment, I think.
Okay, so this is also something I'm confused about, but I'm going to try to build off of this. So let's try to just ask the big abstract question of so why does Hegel want us doing this in the first place? So I get the sort of abstract, well, we don't want to give up on metaphysics, and Kant kind of 𝙤𝙤𝙧𝙚 cool, but we're not going to let him kill the vibe. All right. But but he was kind of smart, so we're not going to go back. And when I'm thinking about the speculative moment, it seems to me that with Hegel, it's as if at first we think that there are these sort of wounds in existence, this alienation, and when we get to the speculative moment of bringing this unity of opposites together, I'm wondering if this is almost rationally reconstructing so that these wounds are healed now. So it no longer feels or appears, maybe we don't want to use the language of feels, no longer appears as this tension that I have to hold together, but now I understand that, oh no, these belong. And I think that's what the concept does. The concept allows me to actually grasp this. And so that, I think on the live session we did, someone offered the idea that now I'm increasingly warmed to Hegel as a thinker of love. I thought he was the thinker of heartbreak. But no, it seems like for Hegel, when you get to the speculative moment, you're no longer in heartbreak anymore. You now have bound those wounds together.
Reconciliation.
This reconciliation. Now they are together. Now it's no longer, how do I do the universal and the particular? How can I be an individual yet a citizen? And Hegel's be like, love. When you do this,
I'm skeptical of this. No.
That won't seem to be a problem for you anymore. Once you actually grasp it. I'm not saying this is the right way. I'm just saying that this seems to be where it goes.
But that goes against what we said before, which is placing the thinking subject in the progression of history. So when I'm asking about this, it gets at the question of what immanence is for Hegel, the immanent progression of rational thought's own self-activity. The fact that you're always, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk and you're always reconstructing. I don't think the moment of disalienation ever arrives. Because you're always going to reflect on it and you're going to reconstruct it. But history has kept moving. And that anxiety you get when you read Hegel and you're but do I ever get the there? You never get the essence of the thing in thought. You can't be disalienated. I mean,
that's great.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So my only response to that, though, is that I'll just say this real quick. My only response to this is it seems that with Hegel, there are always these two viewpoints going on, though. There's consciousness actually going through this in history, and at least with the phenomenology, there's the sort of transubjective perspective that's witnessing all the struggle and strife, and at this point knows where it's going. Knows when you're going through that seems arbitrary, it seems contingent, it seems like it'll never make any sense. But then the hyperview is no, this is the necessary shape and the necessary movement. And so I wonder if there's supposed to be some sort of rational piece there of being actually able to see that this isn't contingent, that this is a necessary movement, even if those experiencing it, it's not that.
So I want to say two things here. One of them is that I think you're right, Lillian. It might actually be the case that the moment of reconciliation never finally arrives, right? We have this image of Hegel as he is an idealist. He is an absolute idealist, right? And all of his books end, with you get to the end of the phenomenology of spirit. It's well, here we are, absolute spirit, comically dusts off hands, right? The true and the actual are one, right?
Or
and
the
you get
philosophy
to the
of
end,
right? We get to the end, it's hey, constitutional monarchy, we made it,
nailed it.
Yeah, nailed it.
It's the best. At the end of the science of logic,
you're
he's
welcome,
just
Prussia.
Guys, The science of logic is like figured it out. We have the absolute idea, which is the unity of the true and the good. And it's like, what the fuck is happening? But like, I think you're right that these look then like closed systems with endpoints that are like, this is the end. But I think that like the sort of spirit, the movement of his thought is like, this is a kind of open totality. It never is closed, right? There's sort of the work of this dialectical negativity, the production and generation of new conflicts that will need to be later resolved. Like that seems like an endless or ongoing thing. I don't see it as like, we get to the end of the science logic. It's like, oh, I guess the true's the good. We're done. Like, I guess we can pack it up. Right? I kind of see it
if
as
only
this,
the rest of the world had read the science of logic.
If only everybody read the
we'd be
science
great,
of logic.
baby. We're
Like
here.
Lenin did, exactly. But then the other thing that I wanted to say is that, Will, I think you asked the question of like, okay, but why do this philosophy thing then, if this is the sort of story we're getting? And there was one line from the preface to the Philosophy of Right that I liked here. He's talking about, reason as this self-consciousness, and then he's like, there's a relationship between like rational thought and the actual, and actuality, right? And he says, what lies between reason as self-conscious spirit and reason as present actuality, right? There's something holding these apart, right? Self-conscious spirit and actuality. What is it? What separates the former from the latter and prevents it from finding satisfaction in it is the fetter of some abstraction or other, which has not been liberated into the concept. So like he thinks that like part of the reason we should do this rational reconstruction, this sort of like philosophical labor, is because it shows us where our abstractions are getting in our own way, right? And preventing us from like living out, making actual this in a fully robust way, something like freedom or reason, right? And so like he wants us to like do this work to sort of hone in on these abstractions that, mostly are just from this abstract understanding and which are like blocking us from understanding ourselves properly or actualizing ourselves properly. I think that's a pitch at least.
You know what's funny? Yeah. Obviously, I think eventually we are going to end up doing a psychoanalysis episode. I can see how Freud would gear into this and think, now that's interesting, but now we just need to burrow in more internally, though, in essence. Like, so what's going on here? And I'm sorry, I'm not going to turn this into a Freud episode, but at least a reading of Freud is that, Freud, the end of Freudian psychoanalysis isn't now go out there and change the world. It is now you can actually be at peace with what this is. Now, obviously, for Freud, it's not going to turn out that the real is rational. I don't think that that's where it goes. But, this labor is undoing, getting yourself out of the sort of the bad infinity of things just happen and happen and happen, and allowing you to actually come to grips with reality or come to terms with it. At least.
Yeah, I mean, you can see where there's an obvious political and ideological valence to this, right? The idea of reconciling yourself to the reality within which you find yourself by ascending to a kind of speculative view of it. Like Hegel, does this explicitly with later on in the Philosophy of Right with the problem of poverty, right? Which he says is like a necessary outcome of bourgeois civil society. Right, it's inevitable at a certain point. You might have like crops that fail. There are different fluctuations and instability in the market, and so you're going to end up with people that are poor, right? And so he says that the real risk, though, is not that there are poor people, but that you have the formation.
Which that's fine.
That's
so
fine.
far, that's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. As long as they are still kind of spiritually bought into, like as long as they still feel themselves within the kind of what he calls ethical life, right? Within the normative and cultural texture of their society, as long as they still feel like a part of it, that's okay. The real risk is not poverty. It's if a rabble forms.
The rabble,
right? And so
when
you get to the rabble, the issue with them is that it's not only that they're poor, right? Objectively, the situation with the rabble and people that are poor is exactly the same, but there's a subjective difference, which is he says they are disaffected with right, like they are disaffected with the social totality. Like that they're
alienated from the notion of right itself.
Yeah. And his response to it is just hilariously inadequate and like undialectical. It's just like, okay, like we need to make sure that there are certain kind of welfare programs in place here. And like, we got to do a few things to stop them from, some elements of Bildung have to be deployed to like.
Yeah. Education is deeply important.
Yeah.
So the problem is when you don't see the world actually as reflecting back and expressing you. your will, that you are actually, co-constitutive with the world. The pain is when the world seems like it's this nightmare that is getting thrown on me. I'm like, I have nothing to do with this. I didn't choose this. I didn't choose to be poor, or I didn't choose to be X, or I didn't choose to live under a Prussian monarchy. And Hegel, I think partially these lectures are like, okay, so we need to actually start educating consciousness to understand that no, this does reflect your will. It's just your misunderstanding. Like, the problem, look, straight up Hegel saying, the problem is you, boo-boo. Like, this is the issue. You keep having fire for the state. No, the state is here. You just got here yesterday.
The state is you. Yeah, you keep
This is
looking
the
at
opposite of like therapeutic.
Yeah.
I could see how Hegel might think it's therapeutic, though.
Yeah. Can you imagine the psychic damage? Like, no, I know things are rough, but trust me, the state is not like an alienating extrinsic force in your life.
God.
It actually is the expression of you. It's you. Fuck, really?
Psychic
I feel like
God
this is
damn
what
it.
makes me think all philosophers just like are borderline like obsessive compulsive personalities. Like imagine this kind of mind. I really can't.
Yeah.
Like Freud would have a fucking field day with him because I actually think the contrast with psychoanalysis is helpful, because if you were to think, and I think some people have tried to think about psychoanalysis dialectically, or like if you were to think about it in a Hegelian way, like the therapeutic process and microcosm, part of that, like it actually does sort of make sense, because what one does when one is with the analyst is that you reconstruct your personal history, whether you're reconstructing a truth, like a there or not, like the essence of oneself, that's immaterial, right? You reconstruct symbols, memories, whatever, and you stitch together a story. And what happens in the process of doing that is that you reconstruct it, but then the self that was there to be reconstructed is no longer there, right? So like it's kind of like the personality becomes the movement of the therapy is like the movement of history. Like I can imagine you creating that analogy, except for I do feel like instead of having that kind of, I guess the difference is that psychoanalysis is like trying to get you to change, to like open up possibilities, and like Hegel is trying to get you to change, to like recognize everything is fine just as it is.
Yeah, he's trying to get you to change or to the same.
But actually, no, I don't know. Okay, so God, I'm gonna get in so much trouble because I have such a problem with psychoanalysis. But because
I feel like this whole episode's going to get us in trouble, Gil.
God,
Like
Hegelian
this might have been our
for us.
greatest mistake. I love it. Though.
But this is the thing, though. I'm worried sometimes that the psychoanalytic aim is in fact reconciliation, right? In just this sort of conservative, like anti-activist sense.
Or at least
right?
that's how you've seen its
I think that's
practical
early
effects.
Freud.
Like
I've
unfold.
seen. This is exactly.
Okay, so stay
Who
tuned
knows?
to figure out if
Yeah.
psychoanalysis is more like
Yes.
Marxism or more like Hegelianism in our next episode.
And to be very clear, those are the only two options.
Those are the
Yeah.
two
Again,
kinds
as the
of
great
things
philosopher
there
Marlowe
are.
said, you want to be one way, but it's the other.
the other
like,
way.
That's it. That's it.
But this is totally true. Like, I do want to just sit on this and emphasize this for a second. Like, because of its retrospective character, because of its emphasis on like finding the rational in every shape of actuality, like there is no activist thought in Hegel at all, right? It is and it's going to be interesting when we do our episode on Marx following this. How do we get to like revolutionary militancy from Hegelian philosophy, which is like what Marx somehow pulls off, I think, right? Because it is like in its very bones conservative, right? Like it's justificatory. It looks at the state and says, this must in fact be rational. Let's figure out how. It
must be because it's actual.
Because it's actual. So we need to like figure out how to reconstruct the story that gives the proof of the rationality of the existing state of affairs. Certainly we're not going to like try to abolish it or something. That would be crazy.
I mean, or at least like, so maybe to, if there, I know we definitely have Hegelians listening. At least the claim can't be,
We're very sorry.
Yeah, are we being unkind?
I have a hard time seeing at how we are. Like, we have literally quoted him line for line, saying things like, just come to terms with actuality. Stop trying to jump over your own shadow. You know you can't do that. At least it cannot be that it will be the philosophers who are the ones who are going to abolish the state or call for it. Whether it could be the case, I don't think Hegel's personal politics would allow for this. Whether it could be the case in the movement of history, it's revealed that the state is yet another sort of finite, limited form that actually can't bring these relations together. Perhaps that's an open question. I think Hegel would say, like, you shut up. Like, did you read The Philosophy of Right? I did attention? That. But I think, we're talking specifically about the philosopher. The philosopher is not a militant. The philosopher
now
is
I'm a Hegelian.
definitely not an actor.
Now I'm like ready to
Wow,
go.
that was a
now,
quick turnaround.
See, now I'm like, if we just spin it around, we're like, it's not about the rabble, it's about the philosopher, because the whole world is just a reflection of ourselves. I'm sold. That's what philosophers do. No problem. Good.
And like, I love that Lily's like, oh yeah, episode success.
Oh wait,
I got it.
That's right. That's true.
That's correct.
Cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh wait, that's good.
Yeah.
Because it is very funny, right? Like the end of The Philosophy of Right. And like I like this book. I think this is the funniest of his books in a certain way, because like, look, like the science of logic is. Yeah, he's not a comedian. He's not like he's not trying to tell jokes really. But like the science of logic, he's like, all right, we're going to try to think the concepts in the we're going to try to unfold all of the categories of like thinking from this abstract notion called being onward. And like that doesn't seem like it's got a history, right? In the same way, right? Like when we talk about like, I don't know, these ideas of like essence or limit, determinacy, quality, quantity, these don't seem to be like historical. And in fact, he says in the preface wildly, he's like, what follows this book is basically the structure of the mind of God before creation. It's like, wow. Yeah. I'm happy for you that you think you can do this.
We love to see it.
So true.
We love to see it. But then it's so true, bestie. But then like you read The Philosophy of Right and it's like, and he's like, everyone sit down. I conferred with the concept of freedom. It says we're going to need cops and corporations and juries are going to have so many people on them. And it's like,
and we have to have a monarchy, but it has to be hereditary. Or else it doesn't fit the idea.
Constitutional monarchy. It's like, this seems way more contingent and like historically informed than these other texts in this important way, which I just think is very funny. Like in concept, I think it's hilarious. Like and again, like someone like complains about the world to Hegel, right, and says like, actually, I don't think we should have constitutional or hereditary monarchs. He's like, listen, I talked to the concept of right, okay, and
like, did you?
This is definitely,
I don't think you did.
You? Exactly.
What's really interesting, and I think it's important to say for our listeners, because I think you're right, Gil, that there is something constitutionally conservative in Hegel, and I think it's not just his political positions, but that reality isn't marked by any irrationality that needs to be, kind of undone or taken away. It really is about the redescription and making explicit of what social reality already is. And it's almost as if it's counseling, social reality should be enough. This should be enough. Why, are you trying to, invent wholly new social realities? This is what you are, and this is all that you can come to grasp. And so I wonder if it also has a way of sort of limiting political desires or political expectations, that it's a sort of call to come to realize that this is enough, that this is what it is.
Well, you as somebody who's interested in utopia, you pretty much couldn't find a more anti-utopian thinker.
Absolutely not. No, Hegel had my number. Hegel's just like, this guy in the future is going to talk about going someplace else. Now, honestly, the real Hegel would be like, sir, aren't you from Africa? History didn't move there, sir.
I have bad news. You have had no history.
Trapped in the understandings.
Maybe even just
abstract
picture thinking. Would be his
Where's your picture books? Look at you trying to write,
sir. Trying me a picture.
What a monster! Oh my god.
Yeah, that's funny because he does have the whole thing about world history. So maybe it would be helpful to talk about, like, there are levels to the conservatism. I made the joke about, like, well, if it's just about philosophy, it's more amenable to myself. But I do think that there is something interesting in what he's saying about the limits of philosophy specifically. And I do think it's worth taking it seriously, because we have this paradigm now of the public intellectual activist philosopher that, like, I think he would just think is not true. Like, there's a way in which philosophy sometimes thinks it's doing something. And I used to think that, and I'm increasingly less convinced that that's so, but I don't have any particular conclusions about what I think the limits are or whatever. But I think that sometimes we take it for when we say, how can we imagine novelty? How can we imagine this? Like, what are we doing? We're just like philosophers in a seminar room, and we're like reconstructing norms and shit. Like, we're not.
Like, what does it matter whether we can imagine novelty or not?
And what does it matter whether or not we, like, who is this we? And so there's a way in which he seems to think that philosophy is important to history and to politics and to all of these things. There's a place for it. We're not just twiddling our thumbs. We're developing the progression of our own spirit, our own ideas, and no one else is going to do that because they're busy doing all the other things. So we actually have a role to play in the social reproduction of society. And I think that that's kind of an interesting thing to think about philosophically. But I think that the step beyond that, which is like, can anyone else engage in that kind of reflective behavior besides philosophers, is like perhaps a different level of potential conservatism in Hegel. And then there's another question of, like, is it desirable for everyone else to engage in philosophy? Like, other people do things. That's good. They don't have to be engaging in speculative metaphysics, maybe. But then you set up this kind of like elitist paradigm of the philosopher like reflecting on the world. So I think that part of it, because he's talking about what is it like to think, what is it like to do philosophy, there's actually something really specific going on here where he's trying to tell philosophy about itself as a thing that human society does, and that could be interpreted in different ways with the other kinds of conservatism that you were talking about with the rabble, which I think also exists. It's just saying something somewhat different.
I mean, I'm sympathetic with restricting or philosophy, or at least kind of forcing it to have some humility. But I don't think you, for example, Lillian, think that what philosophy should do should be to ultimately like rationally justify the actual, right? It should be like a process, like you want to change it, and so do I in certain ways, right? And like I think we should be more reflective about the ways that desire informs our thinking, because that's maybe not actually the job of philosophy. So it's a bit of a, like, as you said, I mean, it's a bit of a bind there, at least even for me just personally, between the fact that I do in a certain sense think Hegel's right, that there's something fundamental about philosophy which involves clarifying elements of social reality, reconstructing them so as to understand them in a more systematic way, as to understand how elements of our history and our society hang together, rather than just being kind of discrete moments that have nothing to do with one another. Like, I think that's actually a really great vocation in a lot of ways for philosophy. But the element of it which is justifying, trying to justify the way things are, to actually make it, to actually, not just to reconstruct it and say, okay, this is how things have imminently unfolded, but this is how they, like, this is good. Like, trust me, this is great.
Well, there's the is-ought collapse again, right?
Yeah.
Like, there is no ought outside of what is, so that like the rational reconstruction just is what it means to justify the existing state of affairs. But like, to go back to something you brought up a long time ago, 10 years ago when we started this episode, Lillian, like thinking about immanent critique, like, we could then as Hegelians, I think, look like in a slightly different mode, or at like a shift in perspective, look at existing society and say, actually, no, this does not amount to an actualization of freedom in a sufficiently robust way. And, we don't have to...
the very thing it's trying to actualize.
Right, yeah. And we don't need to say, oh, and it turns out that like freedom and its opposite are the same, so we're good. Or, do this like a false dialectical reconciliation or something. I think that we also can say, like Marx will, and for a variety of, and at a variety of other levels, like, no, actually, like the sort of systematic unfolding of the philosophy of right, he was wrong. He was wrong. He got some things wrong. And so, for instance, like, the version of this account that says, well, in order for freedom to work, we're going to need corporations. Like, maybe he got that wrong. And it should remain for us an open question to try to determine, I think that for most of us, right? Like, freedom, the actualization of freedom, still pretty good as a goal, right? That does seem to be like something we should be after. And like social critique often, I think, departs from the premise that like, yeah, freedom is the thing that we want and we ain't got it yet, right?
Yeah.
And so like figuring out how and why that's the case.
One thing that's amenable to kind of progressive politics in general that Hegel did was to just say that like the actualization of freedom is an inherent part of freedom itself. Like freedom as an empty abstraction is meaningless. Just to say like, I'm free. Even like I was thinking of Sartre's assertion of his being free even in prison or something, right? Like Hegel's saying no. Actually, in order to actually be free, there have to be objective conditions which which meet the kind of needs of freedom, which actually enable freedom to realize itself in the world, to become concrete, instead of just being a kind of mental abstraction. And so like, I mean, that's not you're not that far at that moment from like, okay, well, what are these conditions? What are these objective conditions which are required for freedom to actually be realizable? Okay, it turns out it's not hereditary constitutional monarchy with a robust police and a set of corporations and guilds and stuff. It turns out it's something like full communism, right? Like
it turns out it's communism.
It turns out it's communism, right? Like,
Wait. I want to slow down just you. I don't want to leave the question of you. So what is the philosopher's relationship either to the state or society as a whole? So what's interesting here is that, the Hegelian philosopher strikes me as rather different than, the sort of historical metaphor we get of Socrates. Socrates is out there giving representatives of the state a hard time, being like, I don't know, man. It feels like you all actually don't know what it is that you said that you knew. And the Hegelian philosopher doesn't strike me as someone who's like next to the prince and being like, can I ask you some questions about virtue? And like, in that sort of dialectic, in that sort of Socratic dialectic of, I think we need to come to the point where you don't actually know what it is that you thought that you knew. And so I think we could do a really grounded materialist analysis of, so what is this thing that we call the public intellectual? At one point, did the public intellectual become someone who sort of launders for the public? And at what point was it, or could it be, again, the public intellectual someone who tries to incite, provoke, stir public sentiment, stir a public realization? But that ambivalence here, I think we're missing that there has been a remarkable transition, obviously from Socrates to Hegel, but this is a particular frame of the philosopher's position as vis-a-vis the state or society. And it's striking me that Hegel's not giving us a picture of the philosopher as being sort of a contrary angle to society. The philosopher is one who is saying, let me make explicit what this is, and so that you all can form and shape yourselves to understanding what this is, rather than provoking and bringing towards this sort of aporia of, my God, this does not make sense.
The tricky thing, right, is that like he maybe takes immanence so seriously as like as a restriction on like how rigorous thought has to work that he can't be critical in an important way, right? Like he thinks any move to step outside of what exists to criticize it is illegitimate, which means that like
arbitrary.
the sort, it'll end up being arbitrary, restrictive, right? Again, we're back doing our like, our imaginary abstractions. Like, ooh, great. You imagined communism. Cool. Again, we live in this world. What are you talking about? But also like, there are weird moments. There are other weird things, though, in Hegel that I think might be interesting to think about. Like, what does it mean that, like, he sees Napoleon and he's like, that's world spirit on horseback, right? Like, there are these, like, moments of, like, sympathy with revolutionary transformation, or of, like, his critique of the beautiful soul is this person who, like, doesn't ever want to get their hands dirty. And he's like, baby, you got to get out there and act. Stop that, right? Like, there are these, like, peculiar moments of, like, sympathy. I think it's just the case, to answer your question, Will, that for Hegel himself, our man was just a nerd. He's not actually out there trying to get anything done, right? He had work to do called writing those 4 impenetrable books, right? But it's
And
not
giving a
clear to me
lecture.
that. Yeah. He is a public intellectual in some way, right? He's giving these like lectures to a public, and he thinks that it's important that he does so.
To Kierkegaard
It's very
and all these different
to people like Kierkegaard and Marx and so on. So it's a complicated picture, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think that like philosophy should just be in the business of like justifying the world. I just think that like from what Will is saying about the kind of different image of the philosopher, I feel like we've come so far from like what Hegel took for granted to be like acceptable. Like we live in a different kind of civil society and a different kind of state. And I feel like the default is almost like expecting you to be a public intellectual. And sometimes I find that this is even reinforcing and justifying of the status quo, even like more than people think it is. So like there's a imminence to taking on this position and like the pressures that impinge upon people who do it. And so there's a way in which if that becomes like the function of the university and so on, and we take it for granted that philosophy can be active in this particular way. And like my students are always asking me like, how do I bring theory and practice together? And like Hegel's answer is like, they already are, baby. You don't have to do that. Like it's all there.
What are you talking about?
Why are you trying so hard?
But their demand is always that philosophy needs to be more grounded, more concrete, more this, more that. And I'm of course sympathetic to this, like as a materialist and someone who's political. Like I want them to be grounded and concrete. But sometimes I actually do find myself giving the advice, like, all right, step back. Like, what do you think we're doing here? Like we're working with concepts, people. Like we're not. This isn't an activist room. You know, we're like assessing, and I feel ambivalent about that. Like I don't want anyone to just accept the status quo, but I also think that like I'm not sure what I think philosophy is supposed to be doing, and Hegel has like a pretty specific idea of it that I think is worth sort of taking seriously on its own terms.
I wonder with Hegel, there's also a very particular velocity to philosophical thought. I don't think it's meant, or it can go as fast as each contingent demand for the philosopher to say something about X can
Right.
do.
Oh my God, I had the opposite. I think his thought moves at infinite speed in Hegel.
Really?
Okay. Wait, really? Because it seems as
Yes.
if thought needs this time to elaborate for itself what the actual is. Well, what do you mean by infinite speed? Maybe like, that would help. Because there's a difference between the sort of enunciation and elaboration of philosophical thought and what the concept will grasp in its sort of moment of actualization.
He talks about that there are these like historical developments. It takes time for this to happen, as you put it, right? But like the rational reconstruction, it happens all at once, I think, right? And then like we have this like sort of like order of exposition where like, we unpack it in its slow details and the determinacy of each of the moments. But I think it's all at once, this sort of like grasp from this grasping from the whole. Maybe this is the specificity of that speculative third moment that he described, right? That like
It's a dynamic totality.
yeah.
That's the language that Kevin Thompson uses it for.
Right. And I was also thinking about like, to go back to what you were just saying too, Lillian, like I think we have to be concrete, but I think one of the things that's great about Hegel, and maybe this is one last point I'll make about what the hell dialectic means in his work, he thinks that like concreteness, like concrete things are universal, that they have universals in them, right? And that universality has to be concrete, that these things can't be just held opposed to one another, so that like there's a thing and then the abstract concept of the thing, but that like getting to the level of the concrete is exactly what philosophy is supposed to be about for him. He has that little piece called Who Thinks Abstractly that he published in a newspaper. Also very funny to think about that, right? In the role of a public intellectual, right? Where he's like, thinking abstractly is just like picking out one part of something and taking it for the whole. And concrete philosophical thought brings together all of its determinations in its historical specificity and particularity. And he's like, that's what this is about. That's more accurate. That's more true. That's more genuine. It's so hard to think these things together, but that's what he's trying to challenge us to do.
It will be interesting to transition from that from this point or this set of insights into when we talk about Marx, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, right, in which he says like the hitherto philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, right? But the point is to change it, because they're obviously you're getting a much more militant, a much more militant conception of philosophy. We haven't addressed the elephant in the room, which is the famous or infamous thesis, antithesis, synthesis conception, which is the kind of popular conception of what dialectics is in Hegel. But maybe we can save that for our Marx conversation, because I'm curious, because I feel like a lot of people, and I've done this myself, I kind of scoff a little bit at that account of what dialectics is. It's almost a kind of reflexive way of feeling like, oh, okay, well, this person, I don't know, hasn't spent enough time, reading Hegel or Marx, understanding dialectics. That's the general kind of popularized version of what it is. But I do think it is worth pausing for a moment and saying, and I don't know if that's the case for you guys, but pausing and just asking, like, why is that? I don't think it's wrong, right? But why is it an insufficient way of understanding what dialectical progression is for Hegel, to just frame it as like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? That is, I think, if you asked anybody with a kind of cursory familiarity with philosophy, what is dialectics, that's the answer, 9 times out of 10 they're going to give you, right? Is unless they're thinking of the Socratic question and answer or something. But if they're thinking about Hegel, they're going to say that triadic order. So I don't know, maybe it's too much to put on the table at the very end, but I do think it's worth flagging.
Yeah, I think at least partially, and I'm partially depending on one of my good friends who is a Hegel scholar. She did her whole dissertation on this, and I was talking about this, and she's like, "That's a really interesting way to put it, because one makes it seem like everything in Hegel shows up in threes, but she's read like the philosophy of religion. She's like, no, like sometimes there are fours. Sometimes he doesn't actually synthesize the dialect. They're just like hanging chads sometimes, and I think part of the issue is it's too programmatic." And it makes it into a formula that is not adequate to what I think Hegel wants. Is like you have to actually undergo the experience rather than taking this. Okay, so this is what I have to do the dialectic thing, right? And it also offers maybe a model of the idea that there is originally a thesis, antithesis, and then a synthesis, rather than it's the viewpoint from the whole and then reconstructing and seeing how that is. I imagine that's why it might not be completely adequate, because it makes Hegel into a formulaic thinker that for all his warts and all, he wasn't formulaic, at least in that manner.
No,
I don't
Yeah,
think
you get
so.
that back to that problem of like applying a method, which seems to be a kind of one size fits all thing that you can then impose on anything, any argument or any aspect of the world. And I think it's also one of the problems with it is that it presupposes like those two first terms. It almost applies that understanding cognition that he distinguishes from speculative cognition, right? It's almost like an understanding cognition way of looking at how dialectics progresses, because it starts with two things that you accept their apparent opposition, right? And then it's a question of bringing these two things, which are discrete, into some kind of relationship with one another. Whereas I think what Hegel does is something more complex than that, which is to try to show their immanent relationship to one another.
I was just going to say this.
They have an immanent relationship with one another. You're not starting with two extrinsic elements, right? You're starting with a concept like freedom, which unfolds of its own, if you interrogate it like closely, that it unfolds into its own antithesis, right? And then, or maybe antithesis isn't even the right word, right? It's just something that opposes it.
Opposite.
Yeah, to its opposite.
Yeah, he says these things like very clear. Like, I think you're exactly right. One of the big problems with this thesis, antithesis, synthesis picture is that it just looks like, well, first we got a thing over here, and then we look around and we grab whatever its opposite is and we smash them together, right? And that's a synthesis in some way. But like the dialectical thing in Hegel is that like no. Things become their own opposites, right? This production of its opposition out of itself is the thing that dialectics traces. It's not opposed to its opposite as something outside of it. It becomes opposite.
And once you trace that becoming other in order to become what it is kind of progression, right? Once you trace that progression and you look at it from the speculative vantage, right? You see that those first two terms were never actually, retrospectively, right? You see that those first two terms were never actually separate in the first place, right? That was a I hesitate to say a mistake, but like a kind of error of cognition. It's a miss, or at least a limited, one-sided, abstract apprehension of the relationship. Yeah, I don't know. So,
I think
All
we
right,
solved
well-
Hegel.
I think, yeah.
I think we
there
solved
it is.
Hegel.
That's it. We're not taking
we
any
kinda,
questions.
Kind of nailed
I
it.
will.
No
sorry, I
further-
will add just one more thing that I do think
Yeah.
that part of what, just to answer Owen's question and like to kind of maybe summarize some of what the responses to it is that part of what that picture misses is what someone said earlier was like the velocity of thought, like thought trying to capture itself, which is like why he'll talk about like it as a part of what philosophy does is a phenomenology of its own movement. And like you can't capture like the phenomena of thought if you just think of it in that like triad way. And so like that's why like philosophy, like it becomes a philosophy of history, but philosophy itself becomes historical. So like you can't just be like, it's not like history isn't a syllogism. And I don't know, Hegel's just like a much, for all his warts, he's just like a much smarter person than that. So
Yeah.
just to give the dude his flowers.
All right. Well, I think that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at @LeftOfPhil. If you like what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy and give us some good reviews. Leave us comments on your podcast app. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next time.